Good morning, excuse me, and again, welcome to Anthropology 4310, Theories of Culture. Just to let you know, especially those of you who are in the home viewing audience, an outline of my lectures is now available on your website under course materials, the same as the other handouts, and also some of the students in the library class, have asked that some of you who are in the home viewing audience please get in touch with the person who's listed as the member of your group identified by having an email address. They are getting their presentations ready because they will be coming up soon enough, and they need to include all of those people that want to be included in their groups and have been so designated. So if you can do that, it will be in your best interest. Thank you in the home. Okay? Yeah. All right. Last time I finished, I think, going over in some detail at least that culturally relative presentation of Eskimo ethnography. I did it using, again, the ethnographic present as kind of a guiding framework. I talked about them as if they were this way now. I didn't give you a time index or anything like that. I did it from a context of holism. I tried to show you how each one of those elements were interdependent with each other. We may add a little more of that to the discussion today, and how they mutually support and reinforce one another. And then out of that comes a holistic kind of notion that the whole is larger than the sum of its parts, that one of the elements seen by itself is to somehow do distortion or damage, or whatever you want to call it, to an element of culture. In other words, it doesn't allow you to see it in context. And in their terms, seeing an element out of context is to see it ethnocentrically. To see an element of culture in context is to see it objectively. Because they really still held to this dichotomy of subjectivity, objectivity that you'll find in discussions of the philosophy of science and the scientific method. So they really thought that they had arrived, so to speak, that they had come up on a way of presenting ethnographic materials in a value-free way, an objective way, a culturally relative way. So, again, it includes those concepts of the ethnographic present. It includes that concept of holism. It talks about subjectivity and objectivity, and we'll focus a little more on that now. And it talks about seeing them as that fifth characteristic of culture, that it is a whole or a system with many mutually interdependent parts. And I know before I'm through with my lecture series, you'll be tired of me saying, well, that refers to the fourth characteristic of the nature of culture or something like that. But believe me, it's important to review that lecture constantly on the nature of culture so that you understand fully what those various characteristics or identifying characteristics of the nature of culture are, as I presented them, as they, quote, flow from that definition offered us by Tyler in 1871. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how those elements mutually reinforce one another. That gives it, again, this holistic slant or thrust. Can anybody take one or two of those elements and show or illustrate how in discussion of one of them, you necessarily bring up some of the others? So that shows that interdependency. Can anyone volunteer to do that for us this morning? Let's take female infanticide. What other characteristics in Eskimo ethnography, as I presented it, would you use to help you to explain female infanticide? Yes, sir.
Well, if you take like individual elements and you don't like take the context of them, with the infanticide, killing a baby maybe in our society might be seen as cruel or unusual, but in their society it was more a means for social survival. I mean, if they taken along with it their religious beliefs that they weren't really doing anything cruel to that child because they would have a chance to come back to life. Which is, by looking at one, if you don't look at the other aspects of their culture, you're not really getting an accurate picture of how they viewed themselves and how they viewed the environment.
Right. In other words, if you took female infanticide and, as you're saying, discussed it by itself, well, it appears naked and attackable because it's a horrible, immoral, we would even say, I think, behavior in which to engage in. But if we see it in context, it doesn't mean we necessarily have to approve of it, but we start understanding it better. And I think one of the things that anthropologists, I know they thought it, I don't know whether, I can't remember or recall the place where they said it, but they said the goal of anthropology is to understand all peoples and human behavior. So they didn't see their purpose as judging other people's behavior, but rather to place it in a context so that those folks that all of us could understand it better. And that's one example. Can anybody think of another? How about geronticide? Anyone? What would you relate geronticide to that would help you to understand it better?
Their environment and how harsh it is and how hard it is to take care of a lot of people instead of just the nuclear family.
Well, number one, geronticide kind of distorts it, doesn't it? Because they really didn't kill old people. Rather, there was an understanding that if you could no longer contribute to the well-being and ongoing survival of your family unit, then it was time for you to make the decision to go on, to pass on, or to move on. When they say, is that the phrase they use now? It's time to move on. That was time for her to move on, the old woman that we talked about in that Eskimo family unit. Yeah, and you can explain it readily in terms of the harshness of the environment imposes on these people kind of an ethic of survival. Everything in their life is really geared towards survival, which in turn is dictated by the harshness of their environment. And again, but I hasten to add quickly, it is not environmental determinism. The environment is just seen as yet one other factor to tie these things together in a holistic presentation. But it's an important one. But Boaz was quick to always point out that it was not about environmental determinism, as was common at that time. There were a lot of folks who were saying that behaviors, especially in other parts of the world, were due to hot tropical environments. I don't know what they would have done with Houston, etc. But yeah. Well, anyway, the point is that you can take any characteristic that I gave you, and in talking about it, you almost have to talk about others. You can't talk about these characteristics in isolation, or you're not talking about Eskimo ethnography. Yes, did you have a...
Well, I'm a little confused now. When you talk about geronticide as well as female infanticide, you're saying that the value that they hold dear to them, which is survival, because that is connected to a severe environment.
Harsh environment.
Harsh environment. Is integrated with the value of female infanticide as well as the value of geronticide as customs. However, environmental determinism is not an aspect. I do not understand what you're talking about in regard to environmental determinism, because as far as I can see, the environment is harsh. Survival is a value that they hold dear, and these other cultural aspects result from survival. So if these aspects of culture are due to the need to survive, which is due to a harsh environment, what is the difference with environmental determinism? I don't understand what you're...
Because the environment isn't singled out as a factor that's given priority over others. It's yet one more factor. It's one additional aspect of explanation. It's not said that all these things necessarily, for example, have to occur because the environment is extreme. There are other cultures around the world that have also extreme or harsh environments, and they've come up with different cultural solutions, or a differing cultural solution to a particular set of problems. So it's not deterministic. It's more seen in an adaptive context. This is one way in which it was adaptive. This is one way in which a group of people were able to resolve the problem. Does that answer your question? Well, if it were environmental determinism, you would always start with the environment, and there would be a one-to-one relationship. If you have environment tundra A, you have cultural solution B.
Who is imposing that that solution?
Which solution?
If you have environment A, you have solution B, or if you have environment A, you have solution.
Well, let's say
C3.
solution B is a nuclear family. Now, so what is your question?
All right. So who says that solution 3 is a nuclear family?
I'm not
All right.
understanding your question.
The environment exists before we do, probably.
Yes.
And when some people, a culture, a group exist in the environment and they find it necessary to adapt, who is calling that adaptation environmental determinism as opposed to...
It was just a general theory at the time. There was no anthropological person saying this. It was just generally discussed. In I'm dating myself again. You're forcing this out of me, aren't you? In 1961, I took an economics course. Forgive me, economics, at the University of Illinois. And we read a noted, whose name will remain not mentioned, a notable historian who was talking about Latin American history. And he made the point that those people who live in the southern hemisphere are slower, less creative, less intelligent, less active and energetic, as opposed to those bustling around Chicago and New York and whatever. So even in the 60s, up to the 60s, this kind of environmental notion as being related to causing human behavior was still continued to be prevalent. And I'm sure if you got on the internet today, you would find some group of loonies still suggesting environmental determinism. So in other words, I wasn't identifying a group of scholars. I was identifying a popular way of thinking at the time in the 30s and 40s that partially, I think, cultural relativism arose in response to. I mean, if you recall, Boas always tried to make sure that whatever anthropologists were discussing or talking about, it made some sense or countered something in the larger society and culture. And he saw it as one of the roles or obligations that anthropologists had was to clarify some of these things. So if he saw an idea or a philosophy or a viewpoint that was detrimental, then he would encourage his students to even do ethnographies around that topic to dispel it. For example, racism. He saw that as an evil, and he tried to encourage his students to, he wrote a book called Language, Race, and Culture, in which he said there was no overlap among those three. In other words, language and culture are not to be equated or interdependent with one another, and nor is language and race, or culture and race. Because again, if you look at our popular culture, it's certainly gotten a lot better in recent years, at least in my mind, but I remember seeing movies when I was a kid where Native Americans were somehow portrayed as people who said, "How? Me Indian, you white man." As if, they couldn't really talk fully and grammatically correct and fluently in English. They had to speak in almost little primitive steps. Well, all those attitudes, he as an anthropologist, he as the father of anthropology, again in quotes, was trying to dispel a lot of those popular notions that were prevalent at that time. So one of them would have been environmental determinism. And there were scholars in Europe and elsewhere, especially in historians, who sought to explain differences in cultures due to differences in environment. So that's who. If that makes it clear now?
Yeah, and so that leads us into ecology. It sort of is a first step in the way of talking about how man adapts to his environment. And so that would be an ecological viewpoint.
What actually was raised originally, already I've given you, not originally, but an earlier time among the classical evolutionists. If you look at that handout that is posted on your website under Morgan, these 3 assumptions that the classical evolutionists used, psychic unity, whatever the other 2 were, in that discussion, following that discussion, was this general agreement which anthropologists continue to this day, and that is that technology and environment are fundamental to the way in which society and culture is constructed. And in that context, in that ecological context, you could even call it, that you can understand culture as an adaptive phenomenon that humans have, or capacity that they have, that allows them to adapt to differing environments. And the other thing to remember about the Eskimo, and in answer to some comments you were making in an earlier version of the question, is you've got to remember this is not a thing where I take human A and plop them down into environment C and to see whether they adapt or not. When we're talking about the Eskimo, we're talking about a group of people who migrated there, and they migrated there gradually. And so that culture, as it were, represents adaptations that occurred over millennia. That's a long time. We're just entering our own second one, or about to. But, all peoples have existed from what we euphemistically call the dawn of time. And so, and the dawn of time, there may not have been any humans in that area in the far north. And so they represent populations that either we think now came over from Siberia. In fact, that's what we think, is that they represent populations that came over from Siberia. And of course, a lot of populations in Siberia are also cold, or may not be as cold as some of those environments in which the Eskimo adapted, but they certainly were cold and they were certainly harsh. But also those peoples also migrated. Everyone, if you take that theoretical view that I've kind of hinted at, if you take the notion that all peoples come from tropical areas of Africa, especially Eastern Africa, where most of the earliest fossil finds in the evidence for human evolution lie, or have been excavated, or whatever they do with them, wherever they are now. I guess they're on the internet. Dr. Story was showing me this morning. Then you realize that all these cultures, these diverse cultures that Boas was in some ways cataloging, having his students, go out and study and note and keep those reports, etc., that all of those represent adaptations to long periods of change and moving through differing environments, and in some cases having the environment change around them. If you look at the Plains Indians area, for example, and we see that culture that's there, that that group mentality is almost that they had of hunting and providing for themselves and what have you. That environment in the Plains area wasn't always that way. It represented a climatic shift. And in that gradual climatic shift, the people also responded in terms of adaptation. So among these peoples with simple technology, it isn't always a matter of change A right away, adaptation B. It came about gradually, it came about eventually, it came about, and possibly other people came up with other solutions and they simply didn't work and they died out, would be the model. If we come up with a cultural solution that's detrimental to us, if we come up with one that does not allow us effectively to adapt to a particular set of environmental conditions or circumstances, then we're also not going to survive. And that's an etic or outsider perspective, a scientific perspective. That's not from a native point of view in the case that I was giving you from the Eskimo.
What I'm thinking now is that, okay, we have an environment, we have people in the environment, they create a culture by interacting with each other as well as the environment. We may have development of a technology in response to that environment, probably. So we have cultural values, customs, which are a response to that environment. Now, years later, tens of thousands of years later, we have an idea that there was in this environment a culture, perhaps because of some tool or some bone, some remains that appear that there were humans living there. We cannot assume that they have a certain technology or have a certain adaptation to their environment just because of what we've found. And that, in other words, what I'm saying is that this term that you're using, environmental determinism, can be applied to technology as well as to cultural values or cultural, say, rituals or...
Why would you include technology as a necessary part of that? If a person says environmental determinism, referring back to an historical theory, which attained some popularity then as well as today, then they're talking about the environment. They're not talking about technology. They're saying if you have an environment that's cold, or if you have an environment that's tropical, in all those places around the world where you have tropical environments and people living in them, they are going to be different in terms of their behavior, and it will be totally explainable by the environmental circumstances. Not the technology, not the interaction, not the culture, but the environment. And he's arguing against that.
Well, what I'm saying is that if you see this environment has, you have found some indication of people populating this environment at some time in the past. They're no longer there to tell us about it. They have nothing else to tell us except that perhaps some bones have been found and dated. Just because there's chert in the area doesn't mean that they have perhaps, we can't assume that they had a technology that came from an environment where people live with chert. In other words, starting
yeah,
to
but if
make,
you find that those bones, I don't know where you're going with this question now, but if archaeologists when they uncover a complex of tools, it's usually found, if they have a complex of tools, it's found in association with some kind, either bone remains or fossilized remains. They can make those kinds of conclusions or guesses. But they're educated guesses. They're speculation. Speculation is oftentimes seen as a legitimate avenue for discussion about possibly what had happened. If archaeologists weren't allowed to speculate, it would be a fairly dry topic.
It seems a fine line to me. It's one of these, how do you call it, like height. There's a continuum. I think there's a continuum in this respect, too, of what we assume or what educated guess is. There's a continuum. Environmental determinism, if you apply it to cultural ways, life ways, or if you apply it to technology, where does it end? Does it end at a...
Where does what end?
Where does environmental determinism end? And where does...
It isn't...
Where does an educated guess begin, or a safe assumption begin?
You're bringing together all kinds of things here that's making it really difficult to answer. In other words, you're talking about archaeological kinds of things on the one hand and ethnological kinds of things on the other, and you're wanting me to bring them all together and talk about the limits of environmental determinism. I can't do that. What I can tell you is that when I said a little while ago that archaeology to a large extent is based on speculation. It's informed speculation, though. It's educated speculation. It's not, and it's also well grounded in the data that is found. If the data aren't there, the less speculative they can be. It isn't a continuum where environmental determinism ends and then, I can't remember what the other thing you were talking about was. An educated guess starts. That isn't what it is. They're ruling out environmental determinism totally and completely. Boas found no evidence for that. When he came over to the New World, when he moved from Germany to New York in the latter part of the 19th century, that's what he wanted to study. He wanted to know if people in the Baffin Islands, I think it's called, how much their behavior was influenced by their environment, which was also somewhat, not tundra, but it was cold and snowy and wintry and whatever, and was again represented an environment that would be maritime. It would be harsh, but not as harsh as the Eskimos. And he found little direct one-on-one statements that he could make between environmental circumstances and those people's behavior. So early in his career, he ruled out environmental determinism, even though he started off with that as a serious question to ponder and made it kind of a central focus of his research.
Okay, so I'm saying then,
Sure.
This is kind of getting back on topic. When you talked about the Eskimos not having a male child, how many times do they have a female child before they finally keep the one female and raise her as male?
I think I indicated at the time that there is no magic number, and each family, and that represents, I think, the simpleness of the social organization, meaning the extent of social organization or social complexity for them would have been simply the nuclear family, parents and children in most cases, sometimes including a grandparent. In that context, there would not be anyone around saying, well, you've had your sixth kid, it's time we have a female hunter. No, it was an individual thing. It was a kind of a biological clock kind of notion. It was time's running out. We really need to be training someone to succeed us in our family unit who can take over for the male hunter. It was that kind of thing. So it was an individual, pragmatic, practical kind of decision making that, at least as presented by these cultural relativists. Yeah.
all right, so in conclusion, I believe that environmental determinism is actually a bias that people in the present have about people in the prehistoric past.
Okay.
Probably, and maybe in the historic past as well. But it is just a bias.
Well, I have no argument with that. But that's why Boas was, he felt he had to argue against it. In other words, again, remember he was trained as a physicist, and he said, I think I said this, but maybe I didn't. He was trying to bring the rigors of scientific analysis and method to the study of human behavior, a la anthropology. And one way of doing that was to dispel some current notions at that time and to foster others, which he found were supported by, quote, the scientific evidence. Again, you have to remember, it's kind of a flat dimensional thing. That's the way I look at the ethnographic data that folks collected at this time. It really didn't have a variety. In other words, as we'll be talking about soon, it was based on generalization, it was based on abstraction, it was based on kind of imposing, I think, a uniformity of behavior on a group of people. As if, in this case, the example I've given you, all Eskimo were this way. All Eskimos responded in the following ways in terms of these institutional arrangements. I did give you some notion, for example, of variation when I talked about family organization and talked to you somewhat about more recent ethnographies that she just touched on, where, if you encourage your child who's a female to become a huntress or hunter, I don't like the word huntress. Somehow it sounds like lioness and tigress. So let's say hunter, which is meant to be non-sexist. However you take it. In that context, and that showed variation. That showed that actually in this Eskimo culture, they came up with differing family arrangements. It always wasn't simply this nuclear family setup of parents and children. Sometimes it was a grandmother and a married a couple. They had no priest to perform a marriage, and their children. And sometimes it was, as when that family opened up in an earlier chapter in the book, it was 2 sisters, their mother, and 1 male. And families then also change their identity over time, don't they? At least my family certainly has. There is a life cycle to families, and that's another way in which they vary, and one way in which I think we can readily say that this view of societies is relatively static. It comes in, takes this snapshot of Eskimo ethnography, and you get none of the notions of dynamism, or that culture is dynamic, or that it changes over time, or that individuals change over time, even among Eskimos. But if you take those discussions, those elements of the family variation that I gave you, one due to female infanticide, another due to the biological clock kind of notion, all kinds of factors impinge there, but the consequences were that the family unit didn't simply consist of parents and children. In other words, I see that as I see that as a stereotyping kind of discussion of Eskimo ethnography when you say there's only the nuclear family and one kind of family organization. Yes?
When you were explaining geronticide, you had made reference to reincarnation. Mm-hmm. Was that a fact, or was that part of the film? I missed that.
Was that a fact, or was that...
Or was that part of the film that you were referring to?
It is a fact. It is a fact that was a religious notion that they had. One of the interesting things about human beings is that, and this insight comes to me from a man by the name of Anthony F.C. Wallace, who he wrote about it originally, but he also wrote a textbook called, Anthropology and Religion or something like that, or Primitive Religion. I think it was Primitive Religion. And in that textbook, and in his viewpoint, he took the notion that human beings have an almost transcendent need for organization. That one of the things that seems to be intolerable to any human, irrespective of cultural background, where they come from, environment, what have you, they have a need to see things, to make sense out of things. Human beings look at the world around them. Any human being looks at the world around him or her and makes sense out of it. And one area that makes a great deal of sense, or is kind of an ordering device for humans and allows them to explain, especially those things they do not know, is religion. So when they look at the stars, and they never can get near a star back then, or even now, they would make sense out of it due to the cosmological notions that they had that came to them from their religion. So, I mentioned to you that the Eskimo had some reincarnation elements in their cultural beliefs surrounding their religion. And that in turn allowed them to think, it kind of allowed them to be more comfortable with having to, either subject infants to death or what have you. Like that. So, it really did allow them to think it through. Again, that's a flat ethnographic description of this. It doesn't really give you depth. It doesn't really give you a three-dimensional approach to this. And why do I say that? Well, because I live in the present, and ethnographies today are subjected to a different set of standards. And I don't want to jump the gun, but I don't think any of you in your presentations will talk about this, so it's fair game. But you can kind of stop taking notes, because this is not going to be about this. But I think it's an important element for me to discuss and share with you, because most of you have had other anthropology courses. You've read other books in anthropology. You know that ethnographies today are sometimes written from other viewpoints or a variety of viewpoints. That if, for example, a lot of Middle Eastern cultures have been presented from, either a female point of view or a male point of view, or you can use both, and you can get a more complete picture that way. I'm sure that if we had taken this Eskimo ethnography that I presented to you in some detail and had given it to you from an older person's point of view or from a female's point of view, it would have been quite different. We're now in that realm that some people loosely call postmodernism. And that's one of the important ways, I think, in which approaches to doing ethnography today are somewhat different than they were at this time. These people, these cultural relativists, thought they were being scientific. They thought this was applying the scientific method to the study of human behavior. Postmodernists, as you'll discover, don't care about the scientific method. In fact, they see it as not something to be venerated, as is so common in this culture, but that at least with respect to the study of human behavior, it's irrelevant. So that's why you can't simply, when I give you that notion at the beginning, and it's a true notion, but don't take it too seriously. Don't take it to its extreme. When I said that theoretical views go from the humanistic to the materialistic, and then it swings back and forth again, it isn't that cultural relativism in its humanistic aspects is simply reborn again, not in the sense of reincarnation, but that it comes back again in a later generation of scholars, an alternating generation of scholars, as postmodernism. It's not totally the same thing. It's very similar in some aspects because they espouse some of the same kinds of views. After all, there has to be some tradition in anthropology to connect the various chapters together. I mean, look how different already that you're aware that the 19th century anthropologists and anthropological viewpoints are different than this early first half of the 20th century. So in order to have some kind of, I guess, character, integrity, structure to anthropology itself, yeah, we see that each generation has some values. They venerate some aspects of their own discipline that gives or provides anthropology continuity over time. So we can identify them as anthropologists, even if we didn't call them anthropologists. I call all kinds of folks anthropologists who don't even know that they're anthropologists. But I call them that because they participate in some of these themes of continuity that I'm referring to that transcend any one generation of anthropologists and are more important than that. They go from one generation to the next. Not everything is rejected. On the one hand, we reject this notion of a universal history when we shift from classical evolution to cultural relativism and in between historical particularism. But on the other hand, we retain those insights from the latter part of the 19th century about the integration of technology and environment impinging on human behavior. And we see it as kind of a three-pronged interpretation or point of analysis. We look to the environment, we look to the technology, and we look to the behavior that's adaptive to those two. And we talk about them all necessarily together. That covers every anthropologist I can think of. Not in the sense that they necessarily agree with that statement I just made, but that they respond to it. In other words, if you're talking about interpretive, humanistic anthropology, you're talking about an anthropology that gives some attention to environment and technology, but it doesn't give it primacy. Because what you also have to add to each generation when you're looking at it is, what do they think the role of anthropology is? What's the higher purpose that anthropology serves? Well, cultural relativists thought it was to understand human behavior. They share that with the postmodernists, by the way. The cultural materialists, the cultural ecologists, which intervene here, and also occur to the present as well, in terms of they also continue to exist, think the higher purpose is to explain human behavior. That's a positivistic. Every time you have a positivism swinging back into importance, you also have this notion that it's appropriate to explain human behavior. When I look at the pedigree of anthropologists that I gave you once before, American anthropologists, we could probably, let's start with Morgan. You could have Morgan, Boas, Kroeber, Stewart. How's that, 4? Okay. That's 4 biggies. Now, it's a simplistic scheme I'm giving you, and this is a long-winded answer to your question, but it's kind of overview and reviewing, and this is good in that sense, I think. Morgan wasn't trying to explain human behavior. He really thought he already had it. You know, it's kind of a notion that I kind of alluded to on several occasions, where to be human is to have this psychic structure, not only in the way you think about things as humans, but really in the mind, in the brain. Again, remember, biology wasn't that separate from culture then. It wasn't a discrete phenomenon or area of study or analysis that people readily drew on. They really used biological principles as metaphors for understanding culture. If you look at those early descriptions of scientific treatment and understanding, you'll see that oftentimes what they have in mind as a model is biology. That's important in all these theories, both sociological and anthropological. In fact, in social science generally, they drew heavily on their understanding of, quote, the biological world in order to understand the cultural world. And that's one way in which you can look at those classical evolutionists. Linnaeus had some success in cataloging the plants of the world and the animals of the world, you know, gender, whatever the species, etc. Well, the classical evolutionists thought they could do the same thing, and they thought that's what their scheme was about. They thought in terms of dividing things into savagery, barbarism, and civilization, that they were giving you a blueprint, they were giving you a larger schema in which you could arrange things into something comparable to species, family, subspecies, sub-whatever, you know, all those things that you read about if you've ever had a biology course. Well, with plants and animals, I think that scheme remains to the present day, probably with some revisions, I would assume. But at least when you take high school biology, or even some introductory biology at the university level, you get this kind of notion that there's, you know, families and genre and species and, you know, and they have these certain characteristics in common. Well, that's the kind of scheme that these classical evolutionists were trying to set up, but they were trying to set it up for the organization and understanding of human beings. So they came up with these organizing principles of savagery, barbarism, and civilization. In that later, in the succeeding or subsequent chapter in anthropology, it had to do with the cultural relativists. So you go then from Morgan, now we're going to Boas. And Boas shifted gears. He thought that they had kind of pseudoscience. They had false science in the preceding generation of anthropologists, and that empiricism needed to be brought in. You know, in between things, there were anthropological events, historically speaking, that I don't allude to, extremely important. The Torres Strait expedition, where these anthropologists, engaged in empirical research. And again, you have to see that as a sign of transition. They no longer took the viewpoints of people or explorers or missionaries or other folks and gave an indirect second-hand account of people's behavior. Boas said, no, you have to have a first-hand account of people's behavior. And that became a key hallmark of a touchstone again of anthropological approach that identified anthropology separately from all the other social sciences and from this previous generation. Now, I know there's some sociologists in my home audience who are probably jumping up in protestation. But even to this day, I can find you plenty of examples of sociologists who never visit, who have never even met. Well, now that's probably an exaggeration. They may have met, but they've never been to the area in which their expertise is sometimes grounded. When I started here at the University of Houston, low in the dark ages prior to the Renaissance, there was a sociologist whom I thought highly of. Did I mention this before? The person who studied and focused on Puerto Rico? I was shocked when I discovered he had never been to Puerto Rico. Well, he sent out his instrument, his scientific instrument of research, sent it there, paid someone to, in a somewhat scientific fashion, at least in terms of gathering statistics and those kinds of methodologies. And based on the results of those, he was able to come up with some kinds of insights. But I thought, how objectionable, that you can talk about a people and not even have been there, not even to have seen persons interacting and responding on a day-to-day basis in terms of the flow of life. None of that. Well, this is one of the things that Boas contributed. And one of the merit badges of anthropology. You're not a real anthropologist unless you've been there. And anthropologists, have this other scientists think naive notion. I speak. This is the anthropological naive notion. I speak with the authority of someone who's been there. Again, somehow thinking that makes it better. And that's a contribution, or that's an overlay, if you will, or a level that I think Boas offered. All right, but there is no, in fact, with Boas, you have a disparaging of nomothetic theory. And I don't know if I made a point of that. It's a long word, so I have to, first I have to spell it right. Nomothetic theory, which means grandiose, large scheme theory. And an example of nomothetic theory would be 19th century evolutionists, right? And he disparaged that. Said anthropologists is too premature, it's too young in its chronology to come to those kinds of large construct organizing views of the data that it has. It doesn't have enough data yet. We haven't been empirical long enough in our emphasis to be able to generalize. He felt you first have observation. You first hear things that people say. You see things that people do. You experience and feel sometimes what it's about, and you share in the experience with the people that you're studying. Insofar as it's possible, you lose your identity in your donor culture, your culture, and you take on, to the extent that you can, the reality of the recipient culture, if that's making sense at all. I'm really giving you, this is off the top of my head, but it's a good overview of a history of anthropology at a different level. Or what was the difference then between Boas in these areas of points of articulation and the subsequent person, Mr. Kroeber, or Professor Kroeber, since he was a wonderful scholar. He started trying to talk about how you can almost predict. You can almost explain. Now, one of the things he talked about was primary and secondary. He would say there are primary institutions and ways that people, cultural constructs, and there would be secondary ones, and you had to give more emphasis to the primary ones, because getting back to this lady's questions about environmental determinism, he would say there might be less variation that would occur between this environment, that technology, this social organization. There would be greater uniformity there, found in many different parts of the world. So he was on the threshold, others thought, and certainly most of the insights I'm giving you come obviously from hindsight. No one at any one time when these anthropologists peaked in their influence did people necessarily have this understanding. These are the kinds of things that I, standing here today, looking back and trying to make sense out of all this, this is how I see some continuity. This is how I see a lot of diversity within my own discipline. And this is also how I explain this pendulum going back and forth between science, or materialism rather, and humanism, between science and art, between seeing anthropology as a scientific enterprise and seeing anthropology as a craft, as a work of art even. You know, some anthropologists take it as a work of art. They not only today, for example, talk about using literary criticism as a device and a model, they talk about how it's wonderfully instructive, and one of the anthropologists that I have in mind here is a man by the name of Stewart, spelled with a T, not to be confused with Stewart, a much larger figure in anthropology. He's a Caribbeanist. He is from I think it's Trinidad, but I'm not sure. I don't remember. I don't recall exactly, but one of the islands cultures in the Caribbean, and he combined his work with creative writing. He created stories, short stories, in which he embedded in those short stories cultural values, those people's perceptions of what was going on. You kind of had, like this Eskimo novel, you had kind of a glimpse into what the everyday given-taken life was like. You really had notions of variation. You had all the things that you might anticipate were you to actually go there. And you could believe it because it would be caught up in telling a story, which is something that we really can hold on to. You know, we can even hold on to other notions, other cultures, if there's a story involved, you know, and there's a beginning, a middle, and end, and it's linear that way, and we can understand it. And we have a reason for sticking with it until it's over. But anyway, I always thought that was a really innovative extreme of the way in which this humanistic influence has impinged. But anyway, we got Kroeber here being almost on the threshold of making this scientific emphasis, this historical emphasis that anthropologists lay claim to and retain from one generation to the next. Because see, the 19th century thought they were being scientific. The 20th century, the relativists thought they were being scientific, meaning Boas, and his major student, Kroeber, thought he was being scientific. So he showed that some areas of behavior were more, I can't think of the word I want to use, but they're more tightly structured. Other areas, these secondary levels of social organization, were more freely expressed. A greater degree of variation was allowed, because they weren't as tightly connected to the demands or the needs of a particular environmental set of circumstances, nor the technology that historically had evolved as well to help them meet those demands that were required in order to survive in that particular set of circumstances. So Kroeber gets there. Well, Stewart's big contribution in all this in these terms? Well, he brought it into anthropology becomes a scientifically organizing and causal. You can actually talk about cause and effect. No other anthropology in his present or in the history before him ever brought that notion of cause and effect into the discussion. And that goes back to that positivistic thing I gave you before. You probably, even if you're in class, want to get this tape on tape, or this lecture on tape, and keep it, right? Or view it. So this will come on your television. I think this is Thursday, so it'll come on Wednesday. Right? You want this one, I think, just for an organizing lecture, and it's hard to get all the gems I'm giving you. So Stewart introduces actual cause and effect. But cause and effect doesn't mean the same thing that the positives were saying. In other words, positivists, if you remember, were those folks way back, Comte and Saint Simon, or it says Saint Simon, but I can't believe it was pronounced that way. Saint Simon, I guess because it's Simple Simon or something. So Saint, S-I-M-O-N, and Comte, C-O-M-T-E, said that there's a real universe out there that exists that's apart from the observer. It's apart from the human being that experiences it. And that, and it's measurable. Well, in the unfolding, in the subsequent chapters in the history of science, you had people constantly returning to the reality that it was harder to apply that set of notions and its attendant methodologies to the study of human behavior. Human beings just didn't sit still that way like a rock does and allow itself to conform to generalizable laws of the universe. Barium, whether it occurs on the Earth or whether it's on a planet 30 million miles or billion miles from here, has the same set of characteristics they assume in physics. They assume, and I'm not a physicist, I don't tend to understand, or don't pretend rather, to understand sometimes why they generalize as far as they do. They just know that there's an ultimate nature of barium that's based on observations and experimentations that they do with barium locally, and they can extend that notion of bariumness to the universe, or sulfur, or whatever. There is assumptions that there's a finite list of physical elements out there that the Earth is constructed of, and everything else in the universe. And so they can make these notions of universality. But again, in the study of human behavior, that's less so. Humans aren't as regular about their ways of responding to conditions in their life. There's variation that's allowed. There's flexibility that's allowed. One of the reasons why we don't talk about environmental determinism as anthropologists is you can set up A, B, D, and C, get out of order there, and they can all be adaptive responses to environment A and technology B. Same one in each case, but it shows you that there's a variation in adaptation that's allowed. So when Stewart talked about cause and effect, when he tried to take anthropology to this more virtuous, and notice there's some values in here, aspects of the scientific method, he was talking about that there's a limit in some cases to the kind of variation that can occur in a particular environment possessing a particular kind of technology. To that extent, it is predictive, but with limitations. There's still variation that can occur. So at that point, there was the closest this cultural and materialistic notion, this set of cultural ecological principles, these theories of culture change that he introduced, were as scientific as any had ever been in terms of the philosophy of science and in terms of having some kind of greater kinship with physics and math and the more natural sciences, the hard sciences. And he thought that's where he was taking anthropology. And others agreed in the sense that they were grateful for the hallowedness which with anthropology was about to be bestowed. Now we're going to have the physical structure, the buildings, the resources that physics and math have, etc. So as anthropology was peaking this way in the 60s, I would say, what happened? What happened? Well, another wave of anthropologists who have a history far older than, they've been around as long as all these others, but suddenly they start to come into ascendancy. Suddenly, students start looking at what their professors are saying, and there's always this generational conflict. Think about your attitude for your mother and father right at this moment. Now think about professors you have right at this moment, and think about how much you really want to be able to disagree with what they're saying. And succeeding scholars are able to do that. And there's all these different strands, these different threads of intellectual community that you can go to, that you can shift to. I know in my own career, I adored Julian Stewart as a person, as a real person, because I found him to be wonderfully personable, in spite of his high status, in spite of the accolades given him, in spite of all the awards he achieved. He was accessible. He wasn't always there because he was a frail man, an older man when I knew him. But if you happened to get him in his office, you could have him for 4 hours. Now, I call that accessible. You couldn't get him on Tuesday at 3, but if you happened to run into him Thursday at 4, you could be there until 8 in the evening. So he was that kind of person. But on the other hand, by his colleagues, by others, he was really esteemed highly. He was seen to be the leader of a theoretical enterprise. He really subscribed to what universities want even to this day. They want faculty who are grantsmen. They want faculty who create scholarship. They want faculty who draw other faculty and students to the academic enterprise known as a college or a university. They want faculty who write and publish. My goodness, by all those criterion, Julian Stewart was a god, if you will, of anthropology and the scientific enterprise, which this administration really appreciates, really rewards, and every preceding generation of administrators have done that. It's the set of values that the academic community, from one generation to the next, always subscribe to. But there's always these others, and so while you have Stewart peaking, you have some postmodern scholars, or at least their intellectual progenitors, making headway, and they are in communication, they are in articulation with the materialists here, the cultural ecologists, the positivists, these folks that came before, and suddenly they shift. And it's not that the whole field of anthropology shifts from materialism to postmodernism, or from materialism to interpretive, or from materialism to post-structuralism, to use all the buzzwords here, or the identifying labels. It's that a significant number of folks who, the only thing really that unifies them is their negative response to materialism. If this were a course on postmodern theory, you would start it off by saying there is no one postmodern theory. There are many postmodern theories. It really represents an attitude, a place of scholarship from which you depart from other scholars, in which you are anti the scientific method, and you are against, to one degree or another, the philosophy of science as the guiding icon to determine what you're going to think, say, feel, and construct in your own approaches to the study of human behavior. Who would I see as a, well, as I started saying, in my own career, I've seen myself shift from being a cultural ecologist like Stewart, because as a student, I didn't have my wits about me enough to have some individual thinking. And I realized in the course of my own career, going from concerns with Ecuador and Latin America, especially South America, especially coastal South America, which is where I studied plantation systems. In doing that, cultural materialism was right on target. If you're studying plantation systems from many different aspects, cultural materialistic, cultural ecological notions set you on a firm track. And then, sticking around a little longer, interest started to shift somewhat. I began to appreciate, well, what's this idealistic, this notion of this group of anthropologists who've always been around, doesn't have the same ascendancy, didn't receive the same degree of accolades, didn't participate as fully in this larger set of community values that universities seem to be constructed around, which also have to do, by the way, with the very materialistic notions of grantsmanship and bringing money to the university for other things. So it's somewhat, they share in that Eskimo ideology of survival. But doing those kinds of efforts, making those kinds of presentations in terms of their theoretical development, I shifted then and started thinking about this alternative view of anthropology, ones that even in the cultural relativist time so much didn't stress that this approach that we've been talking about is so much a study of science as it is a study of values. It's a study of what integrates society, what brings it together, what this mutual interdependence becomes real important here. Empiricism is less important as a value. And in doing that, they set this basis for the humanistic aspects of this time in anthropology, the culturally relative time. But then I said, but they stayed with us. There have always been around people around who talk about their studies, their viewpoints in anthropology from a humanistic side, from a value-oriented side. Which values do societies have? Some values that are more important or prominent than others? Do values cause things to happen? I'm trying to think of a statement that would be a value. Well, I know there was an anthropologist who wrote a lot about, Dorothy Lee was her name, who wrote a lot about values and how values organize culture. And she especially focused, say, in the West on the concept of freedom, the value of freedom, and how it organized our culture. And she drew away from these more materialistic notions, and some of her efforts were really brilliant examples of descriptive anthropology, not scientific anthropology. So she could talk about the cultural groupings that she would talk about in terms of the descriptions that she offered, and she would anchor her descriptions on the values that people have. Well, that has a lot in common with a lot of scholars in anthropology, and especially those that were prominent in culturally relative times. All right, we go from, in my own case, then I gradually, in that notion that there's kind of discomfort because there's a whole area of anthropology over here I have never examined, mind you. And so I shift gradually, not away from materialism, but of being more inclusive. And I think one of the things that brought me to that is teaching this course year after year after year. I didn't used to teach it every year, but in more recent decades I have. Sometimes more recently we've let other faculty teach this course on a kind of a rotating basis. So now I don't get to do it every year, except except when it's my turn. So I have taught it a number of times, is what I'm saying. And so and it's changed obviously a great deal or as you can imagine, from the first time I offered it. So now I wouldn't say I'm a strict materialist. I've come to an appreciation that there are a variety of theoretical viewpoints, and the theoretical viewpoints that a student can select according to the needs of the area and problem of study they want to attack. So it's not that cultural materialism is right or wrong. It's not that positivism is to be rejected or celebrated. It is not that postmodernists are trash. It is rather all of those points of view, in my mind, are acceptable and insightful and bring to anthropology a multivocality, a multi-viewpoint of what an appropriate study of human behavior is about. And I think the dialogues, the dialectics that are set up among various theoretical points of view in any one generation, including our own, is what gives anthropology and other social sciences its dynamism. The fact that I think it really intrigues students. I find students in class who are humanistically inclined. I find other students who are materialistically inclined. I have yet to reject a student because they were one way or the other. I just made sure that their theoretical penchant had something to offer to what they said they were going to study. If they didn't, I might argue with them a little bit. I might want to do that. So anyway, in my career, I've changed, as I think I've told you before. First lecture, first day, I've gone from being a cultural materialist to a sometime humanist, humanist/materialist. I've gone from being a cultural ecologist to a Douglas kind of scholar. In terms of she's my hero of this decade. It will change next decade. Mary Douglas and her writing about various things in what we call primitive society and seeing that they have relevance in modern society. And she doesn't completely reject this scientific environment or set of values that anthropological scholars have shown, but she modifies it, I would call it, along humanistic lines. And when I read the rich descriptive accounts of other people's cultures by anthropologists who identify themselves as postmodernists or as post-structuralists, I don't say, oh my, I don't lament what's happening to anthropology. I say, isn't it wonderful that they are able to incorporate whatever else they may do into their accounts of other people's cultures, again, this multivocality and this reduction of subject-object, which was something I touched on here, that the cultural relativists thought they were being objective, and they saw that as that was one of their icons. Well, postmodernists could care less about objectivity. It's not about it being objective. It's about giving voice, if you will, to many different ways of being members of other groups or of our group. This subject-object dichotomy is reduced so much by the postmodernist approach, or at least that's one of their goals. That's another, I think, value that they share that identify them somewhat as postmodernists. But I heard about all this when I was a student. Sometimes we have a way of thinking postmodernism is new, just came on the scene, just arrived, and since it's new, it simply must be accepted, and we have to trash everything that went before it, because that's kind of a Madison Avenue way of doing things, which is part of our own cultural embedding. Well, no. It's been around for a while. The reason I can glibly move in and out of postmodernist approaches or any theoretical approach is because I've read them all, I've studied them all, I've been made comfortable with them all, and I see that they have an overlay of continuity, an overlay of uniformity, which I have to call the culture of anthropology. And it includes all these dialectics, and in doing that, this field of anthropology, this concern with the study of culture, this concern with the study of all people's behavior, both in the present and in the past, sets anthropology or endows anthropology with this multi-voiced, multi-theoretical approach that just gets richer with each subsequent generation. And if you keep your eye on the larger picture, on the larger happenings, then you will be more comfortable, and you will, I think, more accurately see the wider field that is anthropology. And you're all in this class, you're all mostly anthropology majors, but each one of you is drawn here by your own set of historical experiences that brought you here. It isn't simply because this course is required of anyone who declares a major in anthropology. People don't declare majors in anthropology willy-nilly. That's a phrase that I can use here. It's not something that, when I was 3 years old, I think I'll become an anthropologist when I grow up. I never heard of anthropology when I was 5. I didn't know what an anthropologist was. I somehow thought when I first heard about it, it might be related to the study of dinosaurs. And we get that still. I don't know what that connection comes from. I guess archaeology. But anyway, I've given you kind of an off the top of my head, impromptu overview of the entire field. And it came from your question of environmental determinism, your question on reincarnation, and your question on, I believe it was female infanticide and the consequences of that. And I thank the three of you, and I thank the class, and get this tape. And I'll see you all next time. Thank you very much.